So welcome again, Michael Silverstein. There's this notion in linguistic anthropology of language as a cultural construct. Could you elaborate a bit on that to begin with?
Yeah, it's interesting that when we think about the way in which, as linguistic anthropologists, we investigate the phenomena of speech or of communication, let's say more generally, cultural communication, in a variety of different places. It's always the case that no matter where in the world you go, there are certain kinds of regularities of semiosis, of using the sign system that focuses upon what we call language, let's say, that clearly involves a notion of what we call denotational meaning. That is to say, people do have a notion of words for things, Wörter und Sachen, as it were. So people really implicitly have such a notion.
Yeah.
What they don't have, on the other hand, necessarily, is a notion of a bounded system, completely discrete from all other such bounded systems, with complete intertranslatability of different forms for the same denotational content, and they don't theorize that kind of thing.
Right.
That is to say, you go around the world and you see that most cultures have a notion of what we might want to call communicational praxis or practice, and it's that communicational practice that gets variously understood. My Aboriginal friends in northwestern Australia, for example, the Aurora people, had no idea what I was talking about when in the beginning we were using a kind of pidgin English called Creole as contact. They had no idea what I was talking about when I said, "What does that mean?" Or, "How do you say," and giving them a kind of a quasi-English, a pidgin word, and how would you say that in your language kind of thing. A few people who had been educated in elementary education system knew that, but I'll come back to that if I may. What's so interesting is that the concept of giving an equivalent to something like English language or Creole meaning it was not something that ever occurred to them. So, or if I asked in the other way around, hearing a word, saying, quoting that word, what does that mean? I would get an answer like, I would never say that in front of my mother's brother.
Right.
Practice,
Yeah.
practice,
Yeah.
Communicative practice.
Yeah.
Words and expressions were really part and parcel of what they conceptualized as a culture of communicative practice. Yes? What I fell upon in the course of field work was much like what my friend Bob Dixon fell upon and talked about for the language Dirbal up in northeastern Australia, in Queensland. They had what was called a mother-in-law taboo register, a lexical register, so that there were ways that you could talk every day to everyone but your classificatory mother-in-law.
Mother-in-law, yeah.
Right. And
Sounds familiar.
And in front of mothers-in-law may be a
universal.
universal about taboo behavior, actually. Susan Irvin Tripp, the Berkeley sociolinguist and social psychologist, invented the term no-naming, the metalinguistic term no-naming for the practices of dealing with in-laws, because people don't know whether to call them by first name, by kinship term, by last name. And so on. Anyway, but so in front of your classificatory mother-in-law, you use a completely disjoint set of vocabulary.
Yeah.
So there's two different
Which needs to be
vocabularies.
learned.
Absolutely. Lexical registers whose most salient quality is the quality of this cultural praxis. Right. But once they understood that, I said, okay, make-believe English is mother-in-law. How do you say this in, right? So that's the way we induced a concept of translation.
Yeah.
and a concept, therefore, a metalinguistic concept, right? So in a certain way, I was transforming the culture of my interlocutors, of the people, with my consultants with whom I was working, because they just didn't have a concept of our Western philosophical concept, ever since the Greeks, actually. Western philosophical concept of words, concepts, things. Yes, exactly. Right. Words, concepts, things, and so forth. You know, as is so formalized within contemporary linguistic thought and philosophical thought. So the idea of what this communicative practice is based on, right, may be in fact a whole cultural belief system of, for example, that communication is something which is essentially and inherently contextualized, i.e. indexical, as opposed to communication being something which rests upon a system of denotational structure. Yes, exactly.
One-on-one mappings.
There you go. With intertranslatability. So that's why, in a very interesting way, for a linguistic anthropologist, or it seems to me anybody who does sociolinguistic research or linguistic research even in a cross-cultural environment, one has to be prepared for the fact that objects are not obvious, certainly not semiotic objects are not obvious, and they're not obvious. They're not obviously just intertranslatable at some kind of metalinguistic level, which we can assume that everybody has. So if you don't have a notion of what we call now the semanticity of language, right? That's as a conceptual system that's applied to the world, as it were.
So preceding that idea of language as a cultural construct, there was an idea that one could elicit things explicitly, like
right, precisely.
Precisely.
It took a little bit of my work, as you can see, to negotiate with the local people a little culture, if you will, a culture of meta-language, by which we could then understand each other, that when I say, what does that mean, they'll tell me a translation equivalent. Yes, you see? But otherwise, without this notion that it was their system of understanding praxis, of contextualized usage, that was their system of meaning. Now, I understand that that's exactly the case. The more you look carefully at Hindu theories of use of language, you also see that what you're talking about is a system of praxis. That is to say, it's all about performativity. Since understanding in the philosophical system we're talking about, understanding is really being transformed in a very essential way. Communication is always performative, and the notion that there's merely if you will, a signans and a signatum, signifiant, signifié, a sign, a vehicle, and a concept, is really not what it's about.
Let's make that idea a little bit more explicit, because we're going to have to talk about superdiversity eventually. So when you say that you had to change the culture of these local people, you change it by means of another culture.
Yes.
And you already hinted at that one. It's a culture in which we assume from within our tradition, that this denotational structure is the structure of language. And indeed, I mean, if you and also this idea of translatability. So you, I, almost everyone here at this conference, has been trained in a system in which we had to translate all the time. So the stock, let's say, books in our bag every day at school included a dictionary and a grammar. So we assumed that this was universal.
Instruments of oppression.
Yeah.
They are,
but apparently there seems to be an enormous belief in it, because if you now look at Google Translate as a sort of apex of that idea.
That's right.
And then all the weird outcomes of Google Translate, all driven by this idea.
Indeed.
Now, in a way, this ought to lead to reflections on rules, because that idea of translatability and of these one-on-one relationships and so on and so on was also the idea, you know, that a language had to be learned by means of studying rules, the rules of grammar, the rules of lexical appropriateness and what have you. Exactly, also translatability, a text was well translated or not, and so on and so on. Now, if you would say to many teachers,
the philological way of teaching languages, what was sometimes called the deductive mode, after the way in which Latin was taught. First you memorized the rules, then you looked at something that was the instantiation, the instances of the rules, right? And then there was the alternative. So, but what's so remarkable is that the alternative, sometimes called the inductive mode, was just the opposite. You started with the instances, and with a sufficient number of them, you could say, well, someone would do what we call in psychology stimulus generalization, and would say, the rule I can extract must be such and such. So it was considered. It's just the opposite of the first, but it never gets outside of that system.
Exactly.
Right. So the interesting thing you see is that what we are faced with is the fact that you don't want to deny that there is some kind of systematicity to language as a system of denotation. It has gotten, I mean, there is a certain gloriousness of the field of formal linguistics in which you can say, okay, there is a component of language, of languaging, let's call the practice languaging. There is a component of the practices of languaging which clearly involves the kinds of things where we can say, you know, the subject
needs to precede the verb, for instance.
The subject, syntactic phrase must precede the predicating phrase, or vice versa, or these kinds of things. It's those kinds of formalisms clearly have gotten us a lot of mileage as scientists of structure. And when you don't want to throw them out. You don't want to throw them out because they have in fact been useful even for making predictions, which is the most important sort of thing if you look at it from a kind of scientific epistemology. But the vast majority of languaging falls outside of that. You see, and it's and so you want to realize, it seems to me, that our scientific view of denotational structure, however correct or incorrect it may be, and of course if it's a scientific stance you're taking, you're always prepared to say, oh, I guess I was wrong. Right, that's to say, it doesn't work, you know, or something like that.
Work,
no, you always have to be ready for that. But let's say, to a certain extent, it gives us good understanding of certain aspects of language as a formal structure of signs. Okay, what I call the hypothesis of denotationality.
Which in itself is a cultural construct.
That indeed, but it happens to be a fortunate one that the Western philosophical and grammatical tradition fell upon or discovered somehow, and it gives us a certain insight, even on the language of the folks in Australia that I was talking about. See, that's what's interesting. They don't have to know that they're doing verbs before subjects, but they are. I mean, from the point of view of this view of language. But the vast majority of semiosis that's centered on language is in fact not that. You see, that's what's so interesting. That view of language has, of course, been most successful in the emergence of what we would call the Enlightenment project of breaking apart the medieval trivium. That is to say, you keep grammar and logic, and you think of semantics, the way language stands for things, as being truth functional. And of course you get symbolic logic, and you get semantic theories, formal semantic theories,
purely
so on and so
objective
forth.
sort of notational system.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful for the Google people. Because computers,
Those are the algorithms.
computers are based upon this view of language, right, as a formal system.
And that's why we get these weird outcomes.
Fabulously amusing translations. I mean, machine translation is something, as you know, has been been going on since shortly after the Second World War.
Yeah.
Of course, there were computers which took up an entire building that were necessary to do this, rather than a little Android.
Android,
But
iPhone.
but in any case, what is so interesting is that there has been a kind of culture. Here's again we come to a cultural system. There has been a kind of functional interlocking of the emergence of formal views of denotational systems, the invention of artificial intelligence based upon exactly the computational concreteness of this mode of algorithmic
Seen very often
things.
as one of the big victories of formal linguistics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so,
a great victory, and in a certain sense it is if it drives your machines properly.
Yeah.
And vice versa, that your machines therefore become instrumentalized in a cultural system in which they can help you do that kind of stuff. As hilarious as that sometimes turns out. But it's all still part of, in fact, a cultural system that has an institutionalization and a realization as an institution that works absolutely in concert. But what about everything else that goes on in languaging?
Well, about that everything else, I mean, what you describe is a legacy, you know, that is very much, let's say, everywhere. I mean, every language teacher basically is entirely soaked.
That's right.
With that sort of idea.
Yes.
And here's a problem, and I would like to hear your view on that. We have been raised with the idea that the only form of rule or law or structure is at the level of grammar. Now you say that performativity is the key to understanding what language is and does and means and so on and so on. Many of these school teachers or language planners or whatever would say, yeah, but that's a field of chaos. You know, there are no rules. You know, this is just improvisation. People just fool around.
Well, here we go back, as I said, to the Enlightenment project before. Because once you can identify what is rule governable, not necessarily rule governed, but rule governable, as the locking together of grammar and logic. This is a grammatical form, signans, signifiant, and logic as signifié, as it were, you know, propositional meaning, meaning, and set that apart from what used to be called rhetoric.
Indeed. I mean, which was effect governed.
Effect governed, intentional, agentive, aesthetic. And you start saying, hey, wait a minute, that's everything else we do with communication, right? That's what we mean when we talk about the cultural aspect of semiosis, of communication. Who studies that? Right? Can it be brought under rule?
Exactly. Can you teach it? Can you teach it? Rules,
yes,
you know, like the rules of grammar are the rules of performance.
Yes, exactly. So you mean I love watching in my class teaching when we get to talking about the use of tu and vous, or all the equivalents in all the other European languages. Du en sie, tu en vous, you know, tu en usted, all those. And I firstly point out, oh look, the Aurora do that. They have a Z form, third person plural, which you use when you are addressing your wife givers. That is to say, the people who are classificatory father and brother of a classificatory wife.
Of the wife,
Okay. You speak Z-talk to them. I mean, obvious, what you're doing here is what the sociologist Schills would call a little act of deference. In exactly this way. The Yokuts of Central California, an indigenous American group of people, spoke in the dual. They have a three-number system, singular, dual. They spoke in the dual when they spoke to an in-law. Right. Also,
so many have it.
So many have it. There's a kind of universal here in terms of the formal displacement from singular to something else, whether it's increased number or shifting to the third person or something like that. So, firstly, people are absolutely flabbergasted. You mean savages do the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, so
They're very sophisticated for
yes, for savages.
extraordinarily
Yes, indeed.
sophisticated
yes,
for like
yes,
this
yes,
sort of
indeed.
system.
And you mean they never traveled to France to learn this? You know, and so forth. So that's the one thing I very much like to point out. Firstly, and secondly, of course, I ask people, okay, who here took Spanish or Italian or German or French in high school? What did your teacher tell you? And it turns out, of course, that the teachers, desperate to formulate an airtight, inviolable rule of pragmatics,
Exactly, yeah.
desperate to do so,
And
concoct.
very often in the form of a classroom hierarchy. You address me with
Yes,
vous.
no, indeed.
Yeah.
But I mean, the crucial thing is that they concoct the most fabulous stories about what it is, why people do this, rather than simply saying, well, you know, what it is a performative index. It's a performative index that, as an act of deference, creates a particular kind of social relationship.
And these
Right.
indexes are ordered.
They're
So they're not random.
absolutely.
Yeah.
They're not random, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So what's so interesting, of course, is that indeed, as you say, these matters of what used to be called rhetoric
Yeah.
are really the matters of speaking in a contextually subtle and both appropriate, but more importantly, in something like using tu and vous, in a contextually effective way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because in pragmatics, of course, the crucial point is that what is said always does something, as Austin, of course, realized, but did not have the linguistic anthropological machinery, you might say, to really effectively analyze and tell us about.
Do you have any ideas on what would need to change in order for these other things to be coming into the classroom, into teaching?
Well, that's a big order. People have been trying for years, it seems to me, to bring a certain sophistication about communication and semiotics into teaching teachers, into the preparation of teachers, for example, sensitivity to what, let us say, you know, if linguists know about denotational structures and are experts in denotational structures, no one, I think, has much realized that they're also experts in languaging.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes. That in fact these are the sorts of things you sometimes hear it talked about in the United States, at least, as cultural sensitivity of the use of language or something like that. But again, it doesn't amount to very much, because in fact what you're trying to do is graft onto this understanding of language that is our cultural form that I was talking about before, that it's a denotational system in structure. You're trying to graft onto that. Okay, but be sensitive about context, rather than starting the other way around.
So it's easily swept under a sort of non-central nomer.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, when I teach language and culture, for example, I start out with ritual poetics. And then move to everyday poetics of interaction. And then I talk about performativity as a very specialized case within the Western philosophical and linguistic tradition. And then I get to talking about signifiant, signifié. Then I get to talk about denotation. I say, oh, and by the way, denotation lies, right, and so on.
And create a distance between the phenomenon and the sort of dogmatic explanation.
I think of it as peeling away the layers of an onion until you get to one part of it that has been so wildly successful in European culture. Right, I include, of course, North America. In European culture, this has been wildly successful, and so most of our understanding of language is, of course, a culturally specific understanding of language, as we were saying before. But it's from that very narrow cultural construction of what language is, right, that people then desperately try to build out, rather than starting from the the totality and saying,
Yeah.
what are all the pieces? What are the
Yeah.
partials?
Yeah.
And so forth. And I think what's so interesting about the contemporary situation of plurilingualism and I don't know even how to put it, plurisemioticism, you might say.
Yeah.
The condition under which inevitably everyone lives through the globalization of, at least in some pieces, the globalization of strands of cultures that move around in this sense, is that people are interested in understanding these things with machinery, it seems to me, that is ill-equipped to deal with it.
Exactly. And one
Yes.
example is, of course, the whole debate about the decay of the standards of language in schools,
Oh,
right?
yes. Oh, yes. The decay
yeah.
of standards. The young people don't speak,
They don't speak,
well
they can't
anymore.
write,
Yes.
they don't read.
Yes. Oh, they
Yeah.
can't do
Yeah.
anything, you know. And of course, if you look at the fabulously sophisticated modalities
And if you
that
go through
these
history,
kids,
every generation appears to say exactly the same.
that's
So-
what standardization is about.
Yeah.
You know,
So-
that's
so
precisely
language
what.
must have been quite something in the 18th century. I mean, if,
Well,
if
imagine
since everything has
imagine
gone
what
down,
it was in the Garden of Eden.
it's been really something.
Yes, really something. Yes, exactly. So,
But the thing is, I mean, very often my own response to that is if they say, the standards, there's a big problem, and so we need more grammar, we need more stability, basically, and
yes,
rigor
yes.
in the teaching, and down with the
Yes.
communicative method and what have you. My answer is very often, no, we're observing change, we're witnessing change. You see a change in standards. So, for instance, a multiplication of standards.
yes.
Now, then again, I mean, from that historical sort of linguistic viewpoint that you sketch, that's impossible to deal with. Because we know, that the rules of grammar are relatively slow changing, are a very
Well,
sort of resilient bit,
yes,
although there is
yes.
change.
Yes.
But that the social rules, of course, can change in a matter of weeks, months, years. I mean, they change the whole time.
Yes, precisely. There is that wonderful quip by the late Winston Churchill that the Americans and the Britons are one people separated only by language.
By language.
What he meant, of course, was precisely
Exactly
the
that,
fact
yeah.
that the Americans and Britons are part of a single linguistic community, but that from the point of view of their the cultural implementation of language in actual practice, they're very highly divergent. Right?
Maybe these notions need to be specified. So a linguistic community would be a community that believes that they speak the same language, or that they speak a particular
Yes,
language.
a linguistic community is the projection of this denotational,
Right.
Yeah.
denotational
Right.
structural view
Yeah,
of
yeah.
language.
Yeah.
Whether people have a sense, as they all do,
Yeah.
of what we would call the fact that the language exists in multiple registers, that there are multiple ways of, if you will, saying the same thing that are contextually appropriate.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the fact that people do presume upon, put it this way, in their communicative behavior with each other, they presume upon the fact that there must be some kind of
Right.
contextually inflected norm for denotation.
Yeah.
That group of people, and notice it must be a degree term. There are people who are more central to these communities and people who are going to be more peripheral. But
The notion of speaker, we will get to that. Good speakers, bad speakers.
Yes, okay, good. So there you have, projecting that into a population, you say that carves out a fuzzy-edged, but nevertheless reasonable notion of what a linguistic community is all about, or a language community. By contrast, of course, these cultural systems, Boas, after all, spent almost his entire professional career saying language, race, and culture are three different...
They do not coincide.
Exactly. They're three different things that don't coincide. We keep forgetting it.
Indeed.
Well, why do we keep forgetting it? We keep forgetting it, I really think, because we live in a cultural system which constantly tries to bring them back together again.
Yeah, and emphasize
Right?
them over and over
Racializing language difference, languaging racial difference, culturalizing
Absolutely.
linguistic difference.
Degrees of being a speaker, or let's say degrees of fluency and of let's say, objective life chances, like getting citizenship or getting jobs and things like that. You know, it's
Yes.
a big system.
Yeah. So on the one hand, you have the linguistic community or language community, which you can look at from the point of view of the orientation of people to how they presume upon a norm of denotation. On the other hand, you can look at their cultural behavior,
Yeah.
and you can see that all these other semiotic components of language that we still want to call language, and if I think, at least I do, I think you do.
Yes, so we do share.
That all these other components of language are really essentially sociocultural in nature. And
changeable, learned in different ways.
All these kinds of things, and also like so many cultural forms in the contemporary experience that we have, constantly malleable, both on a face-to-face basis, but more importantly on a mediatized, mediated basis. Mediatized in the sense of relying upon mass media as modes of becoming familiar with them. So we can become partially familiar with things. We can become all this stuff gets
lose
mixed,
it again.
lose it again, mixed and matched in interesting kinds of ways. And it looks like the same linguistic material, so that it's very worrisome to people who are worried about standards. You see,
exactly.
It's very worrisome, and it's. I could imagine that people will be frightened by this stuff,
and for very good reasons, because it really has effects. Eh?
Yes, that's right.
Now you already mentioned the notion of register a couple of times.
Yes.
Standard.
Yes.
Would that be a register?
Yeah, standard is a register, but it's
amongst many others.
Yes, you know, the late Max Weinreich's wonderful quip was originally in Yiddish.
You can say it in Yiddish if you.
A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So the crucial point, of course, and of course, Leonard Bloomfield, the American linguist, in 1927 wrote about literate and illiterate speech, where he said that for the vast majority of people in the European West, what we now call the First World or the North, whatever, nothing could be a language that did not have a written form. Hence, illiterates speak only dialect. Right, and in fact, people come up to me all the time when they hear I do languagey things at cocktail parties and things, and say, "How many dialects did the Native Americans speak?" And I said, "Well, dialects of what?" I always say, "Dialects of which language are you talking about?" There were languages.
Well, in our part of the world, the big debate is about, the disappearance of dialects. These wonderful, eco-linguistic phenomena that we used to have. These farmers talking in weird ways.
Yes. Well, that's romantic. That's romantic nostalgia, needless to say.
Now, of course, there are new dialects being created all the time.
Constantly. Romantic nostalgia is an old and perduring European trait, is it not? After all, how was Landsmål created in Norway, other than for the rural nostalgia, and also as a kind of thumbing of the nose against the Dano-Norwegian elites of
maximum separation.
Yes, maximum separation. But I mean, two things are it seems to me are in play here. Firstly, is the more general notion of a register. We now look at it again in terms of a sociocultural process. We label it enregisterment, and things are always moving into enregisterment and out of enregisterment. That is to say, a register is really an abstract.
It's an ideal type.
Scheme. It's a scheme of. It's a scheme of valid co-occurrence of different forms. That distinguishes for people a style or a way of speaking in context. But it might be a style or a speaking of some particular kind of person, or it might be a thing that when in church you speak this way, kind of thing. So it could be contextual in that way as well. But the crucial point is that registers are organized according to different degrees of salience and even stereotypic consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Once someone starts speaking, perhaps the way I'm speaking, with using lots of polysyllabic words, that it's suddenly salient. So that, for example, years and years ago, I'm talking about 20-something years ago, I walked into my local supermarket and was asking the man behind the fish counter about various things, and he said, "You're a professor, aren't you?"
Yeah. And then the opposite.
So register is really firstly learning certain things that are salient or coherent. So we talk about honorific registers, for example, or taboo registers like the mother-in-law language I was talking about. All of those are quite highly salient kinds of enregistered differentiations. Different ways, as I say, of denotationally saying the same thing. And then there's lots of other stuff that goes along with it, very oftentimes that people are completely unaware of.
Yeah.
You know,
but that are actually again very salient, meaning normative.
Totally normative as
cultural
cultural practices, totally normative and totally interpretable by one's interlocutors.
Yeah.
Right.
So what do you think that makes actually particular, like, romanticized dialects that Jan was talking about, for example, lodged in that enregisterment process, that they stay there? That you said they move in and they stay there.
Oh, absolutely.
What makes that they stay
The late
there?
John Gumbers, it seems to me, in his couple of papers on what he called the speech community, meaning I think the linguistic community, at least in part, talked about two poles of sociolinguistic variation. On the one hand, what he called dialectal variation, where again a kind of romantic notion that dialects were like varieties of a species, and over the land you were talking about ecological, that these things just, language spreads, and as it spreads it differentiates into dialects, as it were, and so forth.
Morphs into,
or what Lobov investigates, sociolects, insofar as the sociolects are in a certain way not yet cultural forms.
Exactly.
But there is differentiation, right? So you can measure frequencies of how often people pronounce a particular phonetic variant of something like that, and you can parcel that out with correlation to different people. Right? He called those sociolinguistic indicators. Another word for index.
Indexes.
But the what's interesting then is that Gumpers, to go back to his differentiation, also talks about superposed variability. Now that's variability which again Lobov talks about in terms of sociolinguistic markers. They're ones that people begin to have a kind of consciousness of the salience of them. And they can be used indexically in a creative way to create an impression. Here we come back to the romantic notion. Here we come back to the romantic notion, as you were saying, that I can speak real country talk. I can index my essence as being really
It's about that.
My endangered language.
There's that too. But the endangered dialect.
It goes well with the nationalist wave in Europe at the moment.
Absolutely, and even regionalist, I might add. That's to say, Occitanian is not national, is not, and doesn't have a state form. Right. So, and that's of course again when you contrast it with the Enlightenment view of denotational structures that we were talking about before. That's why it becomes so dangerous, because anybody who speaks an emergently superposed and enregistered form of a language is automatically somebody who could be another ethnic group, and therefore a stateless nation.
Or somebody who pollutes the language and forces the standards to drop.
There's that too. There's that too, of course. So you have to beware of intermixture and so on and so forth.
Obscene language on TV and things like that.
Yes,
polluting the minds of people.
Pollution is Pollution, as you know, is
It's a very strong.
is another anthropological universal, right? There are modes of polluting
linguistic
almost
pollution.
anything in a socioculturally appropriate way, or non-appropriate, as it were. But what's so interesting, you see, is that dialects, in the sense of the ecological spread and differentiation of language, can become enregistered. And therefore, in Gompers's sense, the variability becomes superposed, where people use it now as a cultural system to mark identities, to mark all kinds of things. So then we get into a special kind of register, which has emerged, indeed, as a function of the emergence of the modern nation state. You read Benedict Anderson, you see how clearly these two things are related. That is to say, the creation of an explicitly enregistered form that consists of, as you said before, Jan, a constantly, if slowly, changing set of prescriptions, what you must say, and proscriptions, what you dare not say.
But it should not.
And so the control over, I mean, it's a Foucauldian form of control over our language. Yes, it's a form of governmentality, in which institutions of society, frequently not explicitly and primarily the state, but institutions in the public sphere, which in a certain sense operate as for the state. So print culture, for example, was one of the massive modes of standardization in
Mass
that
media.
sense. Mass media have take over in many senses the job of print culture in many contexts and so forth. These are the and of course the most massive, frequently indeed, government-sponsored institution, education, in which you beat everything but standard register out of the little things. Right?
And increasingly immigration, of course. I mean, all over Europe, but it's about language testing. It's about, do you have enough of it yet?
You have enough of it yet. That's right. Yes, it's incremental. That's right. And that's what's so marvelous, that standard register becomes, in that sense, commoditized. As identity becomes commoditized and essentialized. Are you Dutch enough yet?
Exactly.
Yes. Are you
it's
Dutch
all about
enough?
enoughness.
Enoughness. Same thing. You know. I mean, look. In the American South, there used to be literacy tests for African American people to be able to vote.
Exactly.
The literacy test consisted of whether or not they could read an arbitrarily pointed to section of the U.S. Constitution. I don't know if you've ever seen this 18th century legal language, and interpret it for them for the
explain it in plain language.
Explain it in plain standard. I mean, talk about a system of biased.
Absurd notion.
Yes, biased dispreference on which a system of social stratification is maintained. So standards on the one hand were really a central instrument of the emergence of the modern nation state, starting in Europe, and then, as Anderson points out, exported through colonial projects, imperial projects all over the world. And now everybody wants a standard language.
And now even as a market commodity, you can buy American accent, you can buy corporate register.
Yes, that's right.
50 words a week or something.
Yes. I've written about that. All of the people who are only too willing to sell you what we would call linguistic snake oil. You know.
You also mentioned at some point you used the term indexical Viagra.
Yes, indexical Viagra. Well,
yeah.
you know, you want to be right on top of things, so to speak, in every possible way. Yes. So there is a sense then in which, you know, standards, as I said, a central vehicle of the emergence of nation states in, again, a local European, at least, or Eurocentric concept of different languages in that sense, right? And without standardization, people can't imagine that there could be a language.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So standard register gets confused with the existence of denotational norms. Right. All indexical variation in terms of the massively complex forms of communication get reduced to is it? Are you speaking a standard or aren't you? And if you're not, how
That's
can
not
you?
really Dutch.
How can you possibly
Yeah.
be mixing that stuff in, and so forth? Right.
And how can
it
you
becomes
function in
commodifiable.
society?
How can you function? It becomes commodifiable. It becomes how can you function in society is another way of saying we have gatekeeping tests for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We will keep you out, and this is the
we'll fail
price.
you.
This is the price you must pay.
Yeah.
Right. It's what
Yeah.
the economists call an opportunity cost.
Yeah.
This is the opportunity cost for
Yeah.
advancement
Yeah.
in a particular way.
Yeah.
Now, it's not necessarily a mode to recognize this is not necessarily a mode to say, therefore it's all evil. It's a social system. It's the way in which this particular social system operates. But to the degree to which the communicative phenomena, the cultural semiosis, as it were, even in the first world, no longer is containable by these.
That's what superdiversity
Now,
means, basically.
absolutely,
Yeah.
by these now hokey. I don't know the term. It's a lovely term. These kind of
Hokey.
quaintly stupid. These kind of hokey ideas, which are really our European patrimony about language.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know,
Reminds me of certain political parties where we're from.
Well,
Yeah,
to be
true,
sure,
yeah.
political parties embrace this because language has always been at the center of the way in which politics and the political economy are structured within our mode of having nation states. You know, so I mean, it's a very interesting locked together kind of set of ideas. Some of them, as I was saying, are useful for certain purposes, but ultimately, and indeed, as you were saying, the very concept of superdiversity, it seems to me, emerges from a recognition of how desperate the institutional forms that operate on the basis of the assumption of the one language, one linguistic community, one nation state.
And also one perfect speaker.
And the
so
perfect,
all of that in your mind or in your brain.
All of that lies behind as a cultural system. And the more the harder that has to work to try to contain what's going on now. And the more, therefore, it's going to fail unless brutal measures are taken. And that's what again. No, so as I was saying, there's a descriptive way in which we can recognize as social scientists the elaborate structure here that has emerged around language, around languaging, the praxis of communication. And we can recognize even with a clear eye its stratifying effects, its exclusionary effects, all these kinds of things, right? As well as, of course, on the other side, the fact that there are people who are in the club and they feel just terrific about it, right? So that it has, as it were, enhancing qualities for those other folks.
Of course, the more oppressive you make that stuff, the smaller that club of the people who are in becomes, because everything becomes an exception, of course.
That's just it. So
a deviation.
So here it seems to me we really do have to make an ethical or moral decision about whether or not we're not just going to be social scientists in this descriptive sense, right, and in a theoretical sense of saying, oh, isn't this interesting that these phenomena work similarly here and here and here and so on and so forth. We have to sort of say, okay, how about if you're a citizen scientist? Right. Boaz was.
Yeah, well, of course. Very much.
You would say, as you were saying, the more oppressive this becomes, the smaller the club.
Exactly.
Has a membership.
Even if you are a member of the club, the higher the risk that at some point you will transgress some rule, you know, and be kicked out. You know.
Indeed, absolutely.
Or sidelined.
Absolutely.
So we're entering an age of linguistic marginalization.
There's a scandalous story about my own teacher Jacobson, who was at a party at Eric Hamp's house decades and decades ago when Roman was visiting and giving a talk in Chicago, and the local Russian professor, who actually was a Sanskritist trained by Edgerton, was like Trubetskoy, a knyaz.
Oh yeah.
Professor Bobrinsky, a knyaz, a duke, a prince of the first collaterality. And apparently Roman made a mistake in terms of highest czarist white Russian standard in some linguistic form, and from across the room, the knyaz corrected him.
Oh God.
Yes. So look at the risk. Look at the risk. You see.
We can always try to abnormalize that, or let's say orientalize that. Those are the weird Russian aristocrats of the early 20th century.
But
it's very much around, isn't it?
No, I say to my students all the time, now that I've revealed to you the entire massive machinery of sociolinguistic oppression, of stratification around the standard and so on and so forth, that will not stop me from correcting your papers. Yeah. because my institution is at the highest pinnacle of what you might want to call the oppressive regime.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And at the same time, and maybe this could be a useful conclusion of this conversation. At the same time, it proves also, that there is no absence of norms. There's no shortage of norms, even in a social cultural organization of language. Normativity is everywhere.
Yes, exactly. And there indeed are norms even of these other components, these non-denotational components, as we were saying. They are understood in terms of a folk system of enregisterment. But there's lots of other variation as well that people are actually behaving in terms of and working in terms of. But this one particular massively complex system, to which indeed the aspiration of working under the umbrella of superdiversity responds, is indeed a complex one in which people confuse standard register with normativity in the first place.
Exactly.
They confuse language. They confuse language with denotational structure. So all of these sorts of things that we've taken decades and decades to pull apart, at least so that they become visible to us as students of languaging, as it were, get collapsed. And into one, and most importantly, and as you pointed out, most tellingly, they become instruments of oppression and stratification
at the individual level.
Through various kinds of institutionalized forms, so that you are summoned as a citizen scientist to say where do I stand on using my knowledge to, as it were, maybe illuminate people, maybe reveal what's going on.
Show what's going on. I mean, that's the least we can do.
The least we can do. There is a wonderful scene in the 1939 Hollywood movie The Wizard of Oz, in which
the witch is dead.
No, it's not that the witch is dead.
It became a hit a few weeks ago when Margaret Thatcher died.
Oh well, that's a different story. but leave the Baroness out of this. In which Toto, the little dog of Dorothy, pulls back a curtain when you see the mountebank, the snake oil salesman, working the levers of a machine that's running this thing which purports to be Oz, right? And we can certainly try to be that little Toto.
So, on that note, thank you very, very much, Michael.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Thank you.